Well, Ann, I'm so glad to have you on Awesome Marriage Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. I love talking to you, so I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, I am too. It's a great topic. So, we're going to talk about couples that get caught in these fight cycles and they struggle to break the cycle. Almost it just seems to go on and on. So, what are some of the patterns that you see couples get stuck in? And then how do they get there to start with?
Sure, sure. Well, the main cycle that I see over and over and over again is this chasing and fleeing cycle. So this is where one partner wants to work everything out and the other partner is getting overwhelmed and wants to back away, right? And the more the one that backs away, the one that wants to work it out starts to chase. And so it gets this cycle where one partner is chasing the other for connection and the other one is running away because the connection is overwhelming.
Yeah.
And yeah, and it really comes from how we learn to adapt growing up in a family of origin, right? So when we grew up with our family, we figured out what's our role in this family. We're part nature, part nurture. So some of it's our temperament, some of it's our personality that we adopted as a result of our environment.
Yeah.
And as you know, I've spoken before, when we meet our spouse, we're drugged up on hormones that God,
Yeah.
by His grace, gives us, so that we can overcome the fear of giving our heart to another person. But that starts to dissipate in the first couple of years of marriage, and you're starting to face these like, well, wait a minute, I
Yeah.
thought you really wanted to be with me, or I thought you weren't so needy,
Yeah.
and yeah,
And then
yeah.
that whole cycle can begin. So, how do you get out of it? You talk about a four-step process. Let's walk through that. How do you get out of this fight cycle? Because I see, and I know you do as a therapist also, you see so many people that have been caught in these cycles and they hate it, but they can't
hmm
get out. It's like there's no way to stop this cycle in their minds.
Right, right. And well, and if they think there is a way to stop it, it starts to become like this tit for tat kind of conversation. Well, you did this, well, you did this. And they're
Yeah.
so busy pointing fingers at each other, they're never dealing with the core issues. And unfortunately, sometimes people get into emotional shutdown who maybe previously wanted to connect, but they've given up,
And
right?
they
And
just kind of
so,
think, I can't do this. And I just back off or
right,
I shut down. Yeah. Or I get some of those needs
right.
met somewhere else because
Yes,
you're not meeting them.
unfortunately, this is
Yeah.
true. So yes, I have I'll call it a stage process
I like
because
that.
it's more melding, one melds into the other as you go through. So the first stage is the repair stage, and this is where we really look at the individual. So each person with that family of origin, with their personality type, their attachment style, all of that, what do they bring into the marriage naturally? How do they show up naturally? And really understanding their mechanisms. For example, one partner might have a propensity towards perfectionism. So if they don't get it right, it almost scares them because they've
Yeah.
adopted this so much, right?
Sure.
So they will also, because they're so concerned about getting it right, will also judge their partner for not getting it right. But
Yeah.
this right is this nebulous right. We're not talking a biblical right. We're not talking a legal right. We're talking this right wrong that they've built in their head. And it's a system that they've used to feel safe. And then when they get married, if they don't understand that that's what they're doing, that they're really actually kind of a little bit in the lower brain when they go into that, like I've got to protect myself,
Yeah.
then they think that they're doing the right thing and that their spouse is doing the wrong thing. So, understanding in this repair stage, what are the things that you brought in? How do you show up? How do we parse that out and understand ourselves and understand our partner, right? Because it's crucial to know who you're talking to, right? So, for instance, you're not going to go to the DMV and preach a sermon,
Right.
right?
Right.
And you're not going to go over to a church and start, talking about the rules and regulations around licensing your car. You need to know your audience, right? And so, in marriage, the same is true. But in order to know your audience, you also have to know yourself.
Yeah.
So that's the first part, is repairing that part so you can really make that connection. That makes sense. And then we move into, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I think, how does someone that's listening today, they're in the cycle and they hear repair and they think, I don't have a clue how to begin to do that. I want to do it, What would you suggest to them?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's just so much that you can do. So if we're talking about repair in the marriage, there's always professional support that you can, glean, but also just wanting to make sure for each other that you choose to be a safe place, that you choose to be a place that you're going to be curious instead of judgmental. And if you're just on your own and you're not working with a professional yet, I love things like personality assessments or attachment style. The attachment style surveys, I don't trust as much because people tend to not like a certain attachment style. So since it's a self-report, they may not be completely um, honest with themselves on how they show up.
Yes.
And so that's where, having some professional support to come alongside you. But we all bring something into
Yes.
adult life and we have not addressed. And marriage is the perfect place for it to bubble to the surface,
Yeah.
right? And we often see our partner through the lens of our own personality or our own attachment style and make judgment instead of saying, okay, but wait a minute, what about me? What about my side of the street? What am I doing? What am I bringing in? And I'm a real advocate for this personal responsibility in the way that you approach your relationship because you choose a partnership because you're going to be together, you're going to be a
Right.
team, you're going to work together and support one another. When one falls down, the other helps them up. And so what does that look like to do that together? And you can't do that if one person's carrying all the
Right.
other person's weight.
No, and so really, you got to get it on the table with each other. If you're listening and say, "Hey, we got to break this," it's talking to your spouse. It's saying, "I want to do things better. I'm willing to look at myself and see what we can do." And I agree. Get the conversation going, and then they can decide: do we need professional help? And I think sometimes we do because sometimes it might be a little hard to discover why I'm doing what I'm doing and where did I make that
Sure.
decision in life. And a lot of times I think you would find too, it's very early in life and we may not really connect that. But it's so many things we believe is truth that aren't truth because we believed them when we were younger and then we keep acting on them
Yeah.
that way instead of
Yeah.
stopping. So really it's being willing to say, we want to do the hard work because it's not going to be easy, I'm sure. And the longer you've been in the
Right.
cycle, the more difficult, but there's an answer. And starting
Mm-hmm.
with repair. I love what you said because I think personal responsibility is something a lot of us struggle with in our culture today. It's not
Yes.
as prevalent or taught a lot.
Right.
And so I think just that whole idea of saying, I'm going to look in the mirror and I'm going to look at me, see what I can, because you can't control your spouse anyway,
Yeah.
but you
No.
can control what you do and not do. So repair is the first stage. Let's go to the second.
Yes. The second is rebuild. So just to speak to what you were just saying is at in that early stages of life where we're taking on things, what we grow up with, we're familiar with, and it feels normal. It
Yes.
feels healthy because it's all that we know, right? And so oftentimes, even as you go into relationships, as you move into adulthood, the things that are not similar to your home in some way, shape, or form feel uncomfortable. So you may not be drawn to them, but they might actually be the things that are a healthier way of viewing things. And
Yes.
so it's just what we all have a limited view and we don't know what we don't know. My little phrase is we don't know what we don't know until we get the chance to know, right? We get to learn. We get to learn
Yeah.
what we don't know. So from there, we go to the rebuild phase because once we kind of unearth all of this and start to realize and have these aha moments, we see that maybe we do have something we bring to the table, that maybe it's not appropriate
Hmm.
for the introverted intellect to view their spouse through their own personality versus the boisterous kind of commanding personality, right? So it's not that one of those personalities is wrong, it's how do you navigate that personality in a healthy way. And in this stage, we really look at the stories we tell ourselves
Mm.
because when we start to realize how different we are, it's easy to make stories about what that means. And if we're not intentional about believing the true story, the stories we make, and as we will ruminate and ruminate and ruminate when we have a problem. And if we don't get the true story, we will make a story up in our head and then we will believe it. And
Yeah.
that's what most people do in their marriages. And so they start believing a story about their spouse So, like I was referring to earlier, a spouse who maybe is a little bit more easily overwhelmed by emotional conversations is perceived as not loving you, not
Mhm.
caring about you because they have to leave sooner. And the one that's maybe more aggressive in making sure we work out the conflict is seen as overbearing or demanding or critical, right? But that may or may not be the intention, but the stories we make up in our head may make that intention in our mind. And so learning to rebuild the true story of what's really happening in the relationship now that we identify who we are and how we show up.
Yeah, and just being willing to admit that there's some things there that just aren't good or aren't healthy. I
Sure.
think what you said, I think so many people I've dealt with that they grow up in a home that they really think things are normal. And what I tell couples, bring the good things, but remember there's things you want to leave behind. And sometimes we're not aware of that. I've had so many people over the years that have just said, I didn't know my home life was that dysfunctional until I met his parents, or because my best friend, I went home for Thanksgiving weekend from school and I thought, oh my gosh, this is very
Hmm.
different. So
Hmm.
I think it's what you said is right, that people shouldn't, you don't judge yourself because you grew up in a home and you didn't realize things were crazy
Yeah.
or just a little off, but now's the time to say, I want to break. And you're really breaking your cycle. And then
Mhm.
in turn, that helps break your marriage cycle.
Right. Absolutely. And it's a spectrum, right? Because some things are really crazy behaviors and some things are just a bent in a certain direction. And that certain direction may not be wrong, but you've got to think about who you're in relationship with. So,
Yeah.
for example, say you grew up in a family where debating politics and sports and things was just fun. It was entertainment. Everybody would say, no, it's this way, it's this way, it's this way. But then you marry somebody who didn't grow up in that type of environment. Now you're trying to debate with them, thinking it's going to be fun, and they're hurt and they're offended. It's not that you can't
Yeah.
debate with somebody who wants to debate with you. That might be fun, but it's not fun for your spouse. And it's
Right.
not wrong that it's not fun for your spouse. So dial it back
Yeah.
and approach the relationship for who you're married to.
Because that spouse is gonna withdraw, I would guess. What
Yeah,
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 you're just not gonna.
absolutely.
Yeah, that's so good. Um, so we've got repair, we've got rebuild. Where to go next?
Restore. So in the restore stage, we really look at the reality that 69% of conflict, according to research, is never resolved in marriage, right? So what do we do with that? And we've got to restore that sense of appreciation and admiration for one another, that even when we agree to disagree, we can be happy about it, that we can joyfully come up with compromise, that we can really meld the way that we show up together without having to be we want to be unified, not uniform,
Mm,
because God brought the two of you together for a plan and a purpose for your family. That He's got elements of His image in each of you that your kids need. And so we don't want to let the conflict get out of control. And we want to make sure that while we're speaking the truth, we're not forgetting to speak it in love. And we want to make sure that we're appreciating and affirming and admiring one another because there are such beautiful, unique gifts. So this is where we're really restoring the positive now, right? So
mhm.
we're really building on what we've already started with. And as I said, all these stages kind of move into one another. And sometimes you'll be in the restore stage, and all of a sudden you realize something down here was holding you back, and you've got to go back and address this and pull it back up. But each
Sure.
time you get that much closer in your relationship and that much more of a real unified team.
Yeah, it's really just seeing yourself. I think the last word you said there, team. We are a team in this thing. It's not trying to change me or change her or him. It's trying to,
Mhm.
how's a team do we make this marriage work? And I think I heard you say things like, I see empathy there, just really trying to put yourself in their shoes. And, I
Mhm.
think I learned that Nancy grew up and we've talked about it a lot in a real dysfunctional family. And so
Right.
she knew it wasn't right. She knew it wasn't what it should be, but she didn't know how to change that, and she didn't know all the things there. So it took. I had to just, it was kind of like, okay, your family was messed up, mine was great. Let's do things my family's well. Well, that didn't work. at all.
Right.
So I had to understand her and come alongside her, and I love her parents. It wasn't like I
Yeah.
wanted them to just be completely gone. We
Right.
just need to know how to set boundaries with them and how to realize what the messages she got growing up and how that was affecting her today, and in turn it was affecting us. So I think
Right.
understanding those differences is a big part then, isn't it, of and
Yeah.
not putting that down, just saying that's the reality we live in.
Right. Right. And well, and that brings us to the receive stage because this place to be able to receive from one another whatever may have been missing growing up, right? So oftentimes we're drawn to somebody who is going to bring out the parts of us that need to grow the most,
Hmm.
right? And so when we learn as a team to be there and receive from one another, to support one another,
Mhm.
to give love to one another, to hold your hand and just be present, and that empathy that you mentioned. And I just want to point out that you said to put yourself in their shoes, and that's such an important piece because oftentimes people say, well, what would I feel if I was going through that?
Yes,
But back to the very beginning, we've got different personalities, different attachment styles. It doesn't matter what you feel in that situation.
exactly.
What matters is what do they feel in their shoes, right? And that level of empathy where you're really able to give and receive compassion and empathy and support and love, that you can hold space for one another without having to have your say, without having to make it, exactly even. That when one falls down, the other helps them up, and it's not a competition, but
Yeah,
it's just being present for one another.
absolutely, and that makes such a difference in a marriage when we get to that point, doesn't it? Where we
Yeah.
really are working together with each other and not trying to change each other, which
Yeah.
I think probably every couple does that a little bit. I mean, and I think the sooner we
Sure.
realize that, the sooner we can start getting on with really what our marriage is. Because
Yeah.
my experience is I've never worked with a couple that were exactly alike, and I think God makes us different for a reason. I think if Nancy and I were exactly alike, it would be boring. We've
Yeah.
learned, and
Yeah.
we have learned from each other and grown from each other, and we figure out how to do things, and we made a ton of mistakes. But I think we just kind of things you're saying, you can keep persevering and you try to work on it together because there's always an answer.
Yeah.
Just
I think about the scripture that says that God made them in his image. He made them feel male and female. And while there's the two components, right, the two different genders, so to speak, there's also a world of people, right? No one person has the perfect image of God in the way
yeah,
that they reflect his image. Now, the Holy Spirit is perfect inside them, but as far as their way of showing up, but so we all bring unique aspects that reflect God because we're made in his image to the table. So
mm,
why would you want to have a clone of yourself? You're just
right,
limiting the reflection of God in your family, right? It's exciting to be able to have that those different components in the relationship, and to
yeah,
be able to create that safety, because once we get to that receive stage, we also talk about it as the bliss stage, when you finally get to that place
yeah,
where you're secure in your skin, and it's okay that things weren't okay. It's okay that your spouse maybe is really sensitive in this one area, and they need some extra kit gloves from you in that time. That's fine. That you can do that without feeling like I'm having to give more than they are, or
right,
any kind of injustice, in there.
right.
And so that makes such a difference.
Yeah, it's like we've got to be for each other, and instead of if we get stuck in the criticizing, they need to change. I don't. That's not gonna get us anywhere. And so, yeah, I think when I learned to try to empathize with Nancy, try to walk in her shoes, and it made such a difference because I wasn't
Yeah.
judging her like that I
Mhm.
did early in marriage, and I was able to say,
Sure.
"Well, this is who she is. Okay, so if I talk to her about this way, she's gonna feel loved and cared for, and we can still get the same end result that I want
Hmm.
instead of just being
Yeah.
critical," which we're both type A, so she didn't just sit there and go, "Huh," it was like she fights back. So
Right.
that wasn't work. One thing I wanted to go back, I just thought of that you said earlier, and that was what you said. I think 69% of conflict is never resolved, something like
In
that.
marriage, yeah. According
And
to research, yeah, 69% of conflict in marriage is never actually resolved.
but it doesn't go away, does it?
No,
You know,
no, it doesn't go away. And that's where, covering everything with that empathy, compassion, that mercy, that grace, to be able to figure out, how do we make this work anyway?
yeah,
How do we make this work anyway? One of the things that I see a lot in couples is, when one partner is maybe coming from a very overtly bad background and the other partner doesn't have a bad background, or at least they don't think so. And they're like, my family was great, my family was perfect. And then we end up with this dynamic where when we start to kind of parse things out, especially in certain generations, there are some people who actually had didn't have the emotional support they needed, so they can do the facts very well of life without getting their feathers ruffled. But as far as doing the empathy, the compassion, the being there for their kids in a way that helps them to feel supported, like that feels foreign, right? And so having to parse out, just because something looks overtly kind of worse doesn't mean it is. It's just a different thing,
yeah.
right? And just because something looks like it's better doesn't mean it is. It just is different. And we get to figure that out together.
Yeah, that's so good. And that's what the fun thing is when you finally get on that and say, we're gonna figure this out together. And so those aha moments you both share in and and
Yeah.
and rejoice in, and like we made a step. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that have grown our marriage, but that is one of the things when we learn to begin to do that, and we still don't do it perfect all the time, for sure.
Sure.
But it made a huge difference for us to realize, okay, we can work through these things together. We can be on the same team here, and we can stop these cycles and move forward and not have that junk around all the time, because the things that we were
Right.
leaving unresolved didn't go away. They came back in different ways all the time, and then it would spin us back into that same fight cycle every time. And I think if once we learn to resolve things, at least it eliminated those things from coming back up again.
Right. Well, sometimes it's even as much as just choosing to let go of something. For instance,
Yeah.
one of the areas that couples argue over a lot of parenting style, right?
Yeah.
So mom maybe stereotypically is home with the kids more than dad is, and so she's got all these rules for the house. But then when she goes out to for girls' night or on a trip to see friends or whatever, and the husband's home with the kids, all of a sudden she's critical because he's not doing everything the way she would want it done. And it's like,
Right.
okay, well, really, does that matter? I mean, okay, so they're going to eat Oreos every night, a whole bag of Oreos every night. Is that
Right.
going to kill
Right.
them for a week? No, it's not.
No.
It's
No.
okay. It's okay. Whether you would do it yourself, and when you can turn that into kind of a fun, like joking, there we go with the Oreos again.
Yeah.
Okay, see you next
Exactly.
week.
And knowing that, I think that allows your kids to see a different side, and to connect with their dad, because yeah, most couples, probably the mom does spend more time even when they both work. It seems to work out that
Mhm.
way. And to know, yeah, I have a friend, and his wife was out of town for a night, and he took his two boys to Target or Walmart, and where they had the Nerf guns, and he said, choose well, because I'm choosing this one. And they all bought their Nerf guns, and they had Nerf gun fights while mom was gone. They
Yeah,
and
perfect.
and it was great, and they loved it. And so I think to be able, as a wife, to see there is value in that, and those boys having that time with their dad, to just do things like
Yeah,
that, to, like you said, to rejoice in that. I'm so thankful I
right,
have a husband that loves to play with our kids, and to do things that
right.
way. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that can be part of dealing with some of that 69% conflict. And so you don't have to agree. Just
Yeah,
love each other where
there's
you
some things
are.
we can let
Just
go
like
of,
each
right?
other.
Because they're
Yeah.
not, yeah, they're not life changing, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
since we all have meaning making brains, so often we make assumptions about our spouse. We've kind of hit on that a little bit. Then they may not be true.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are some key questions that spouse can use to challenge their assumptions as they try to understand their spouse better? Because I think we all have that tendency to make those
Mm-hmm.
assumptions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I can give you questions, and it first things first, it's how you ask the question,
Yeah.
right? Because I can say, why do you do it that way? Right? Or I can say, why do you do it that way?
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally different heart behind it, right? One is actually curious and the other is judgmental. So more than which questions you ask.
Mm,
It's how are you asking? Are you asking with a genuinely curious spirit? And if you find that you're not being genuinely curious, because sometimes people tell themselves the story, well, I know my spouse. We've tried this before and it's never worked. And whenever I say that, they ignore me or, you know, and if you shift from that, so maybe you did try to tell your spouse, fill in the blank, whatever it might be, and they didn't honor your request, you can even come back with a curious question like, okay, help me understand. So I asked you this. I thought you said yes. Can you help me understand why it didn't happen? Right? That's
absolutely.
much different than nagging or criticizing or overwhelming. And there's just so many things that you can do. You can always slow down when your spouse is talking to you about something and just ask them what they're feeling about it because a lot of people don't know what their emotions are.
Absolutely.
You ask them what they're feeling, and they'll say, well, I feel like you're not being nice enough. That's not an emotion. What are you feeling? What's
Yeah.
the emotion word for that? Right. And then again, I'm angry. Well, anger is a secondary emotion. What's the emotion under the anger? Right.
Ab-
And be okay with asking those questions. So, how are you feeling about that? What would you have liked to do differently? What would your best outcome be for the situation? you know, Questions that are open ended, that are curious, that are open, that are okay with not necessarily agreeing right off the bat. There might need to be some back and forth to get to that
Sure.
place to make sure that you're not making up a meaning that's not true.
Yeah, that's so good because I think that's it's something we all need to do very
Hmm.
much. So, um, what about a couple or people that say they tried counseling and it didn't work? And as counselors, we hate to hear that.
Yeah,
Why does that
yeah,
happen?
yeah. Well, many reasons, right? I mean, you know this. So sometimes it's that they start too late, right? They wait until things are really out of control. And
Yeah.
then they expect that, well, my insurance covers 6 sessions. So in 6 sessions, we're going to be fine, right?
Yes.
But,
Right.
it's been 20 years of havoc, right? Or even less than that, because most couples, I can't remember the stat on this, it's something like they wait, I want to say somewhere between 4 and 6 years past the time when the problem starts happening before they actually seek counseling. So
Absolutely.
by the time they actually come to the table, they're usually at that place where they're tit for tat and, pointing fingers and blaming and shaming and all of those things. And they haven't really ever gotten to even that first stage we talked about before with the repair stage. And so one of the things is that they wait too long. And
Mm.
another thing is we also know that not every counselor is created equal, right? Everybody
Right.
has their strengths and their weaknesses. And as much as I love the field, there are some people who are in counseling for the purposes of working out their own feelings,
Yeah.
and they put that on their clients. And so that's not helpful. So you really want to choose somebody who is very grounded in what they're working with you on, right? You don't want, and when it comes to couples therapy, you don't want a referee. A lot of couples think that they do want a referee. They want to go in there and they want you to take sides and they want to be able to, put the blame somewhere, who needs to change, instead of really create that mutual understanding. And that early part that you and I talked about, that repair part, gets jumped over, and the story meaning making brain part is getting jumped over, and we're going straight to how do we deal with the conflict. Well, if you say I feel I need, that will solve everything. Well, it doesn't, because we are whole people, we have feelings
Mm.
and emotions. So you want to really work with somebody who understands that couples therapy is just not just a referee kind of situation.
Yeah.
And then
No, I was just saying,
yeah,
yeah, if a couple comes in for counseling and they want me to say who's right and who's wrong, that's not what I do, and that's
yeah,
not healthy for them because then one person walks out as a winner, one as a loser, and in my opinion, the marriage is lost when they walk
right,
out like that.
right. Right. Well, and another one too, sometimes it just when it's just starting to get close to breaking through, it's really hard.
Yeah,
And then one or both partners say, this is too much, I can't take it, and they quit.
yeah,
And it's usually right at that point where you're getting ready to go over the horizon and start to go downhill the other side of the slope and go, oh, this is easy, but it's not, it's work to get there. And so sometimes people get a little scared by the process and stop too soon.
Yeah, so persevere. I mean, if you're
Hmm.
working with a counselor, what let me ask you this, say somebody's listening and say, "Okay, God, this sounds good." And how do they find a good counselor?
Well, that's a good question. So there's multiple resources out there to find people. I actually find that one of the most important things is to actually have a conversation with them before you engage them,
Ah,
and to look for their approach, ask them for their approach. And I encourage people to ask a question that maybe even saying you heard me on here and you said, oh, I heard somebody saying that a counselor, often there can be counselors that are working out their own stuff while they're still counseling other people, and they do it in session. Have you ever heard that? And if they're offended, you know right away that's not the
that's not
counselor
where
for
you wanna
you.
go. Yeah. No, and I
Because
think it's so good because I think people I don't know, I think sometimes people are afraid to ask those questions, and it doesn't yeah, I would
Mhm.
much rather someone call me and say even if they made an appointment before they come in and say, "I just have a few questions." Absolutely. I wanna answer
Mhm.
those because I want there not to be a surprise, and I want them to be comfortable that I'm the person that they feel like God has led them to help them at that point.
Right. Right, right. And that's of course a big piece right there is, praying about the person and just having a good sense because not every personality hits it off. And just because there's somebody who may be able to help lots of couples, they may not be the right person for you, and that's
Right.
okay because you are important enough as a couple and as an individual to get the support you need for your family. And sometimes people feel obligated to, well, I'm being critical, and the time to be critical is before you start the counseling.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then once you buy in and really, is make sure you're found somebody that you feel like you can trust.
Yeah, you don't wanna spend 2 or 3 sessions just doing that process where you could do it even before you come in and feel
Yeah.
comfortable coming in with that. I'm gonna go back to one other thing that we talked about is and that is waiting too long because I think both you and I have seen that. I mean, if a couple comes in and tells me and I always ask them, "When did this start?" If they say a month ago, I wanna jump up and down and high five them. But most of them say 3 years, 4 years, I've had couples say, "Probably 10 years we've been doing it this way." And so
Right,
for us to encourage those couples, man, don't wait.
right,
Do it.
right.
Do it today. Take that step. I
Absolutely.
don't think they'll ever regret taking that step.
Right. No, I don't think so either. And my kids aren't married yet, but my intention is to give them, shh, don't tell them. The wedding gift is a good solid counselor that they can then loop back around to, do some pre-marriage counseling and loop back around to a year or two into the marriage and say, hey, how are we doing? And just get that feedback because I'm a strong advocate of, just making sure you're well, right?
Absolutely.
Psychology didn't start off with this idea of only treating the mentally ill. That wasn't back at the turn of the 20th century. The plan was to augment the well-being for people and to cultivate genius, but all that's been thrown out with the bathwater after the world wars. And we want to make sure we're doing well. We don't want to just hit baseline. We want to move north of baseline and really have a strong, healthy personal relationship with ourselves and with our spouse.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Hmm.
One other thing I think we ought to talk about just a minute is men and feelings. We talked about feelings, and I think my experience is, and it's not universal because I've had guys that were the feeling person in the
Yeah.
relationship, and the
Hmm.
wife wasn't. But probably in general, most of the time it is the wife. What would you say to a guy that he said, "Oh, I don't want to talk about my feelings," whatever reason it is, maybe we were so many guys. I hope we don't have as much now, but there was certainly in my generation and probably a little bit after that, where you don't show your feelings.
Right.
A guy never cries and things like that. So we came up had those messages, but yet what I've learned from Nancy's relationship, I've got to talk about my feelings, and I've got
Right.
to it used to bug me that she wanted me to talk about my feelings, and she wouldn't let me. Kind of like you
Yeah.
were going a while ago, she wouldn't let me off the hook with it. It wasn't like, well, I'm angry. Well, why are you angry? What's behind that? Well, I'm angry, you know? And so what would you say to guys that are just scared to death to take that step toward
Yeah.
letting those
Yeah.
feelings come out?
Oh, such a great question. So I so agree with you. A lot of children of Depression era parents were just taught to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, don't whine and complain, just get it done. And so this idea of nurturing the sensitive side, the emotional intelligence just wasn't there.
Yeah.
And then, there is some difference between men and women stereotypically, but you're right. It's the other way around sometimes. I have definitely worked with couples where it was the woman who is less emotionally available. And what is true is if we do not deal with our emotions, they seep out everywhere else. It's not that you don't have them.
Yeah.
It's that sudden fit of rage was actually because there was a whole slew of emotions underneath it that you weren't dealing with, and your brain just couldn't take it anymore and you exploded, right? Or that depression that came out of nowhere. You can't figure out why. You look at your life and like, I have a beautiful wife, I have great kids, I have a great job. Why am I depressed?
Yeah.
Well, that came because you weren't dealing with what you were feeling. You weren't tabling whatever topics that had happened. I had one client who grew up Depression era parents and good, solid, hardworking, always there for them, emotionally just not available, but
Mm,
always there for them. And he experienced, as a young boy, a tornado, and his mom didn't know what to do.
mm,
And so he was like 6 and his brother was like 8, something like that. His brother had learned at school what to do for a tornado. So his 8-year-old brother takes over and they go in the basement and they're fine. But nobody ever talked about that experience or what
mm.
was felt by that. Later in life, something happened in his marriage that triggered a PTSD response, not just because of what happened later in the marriage, but because he had this PTSD from childhood that he had never learned to process. And so it was coming out with him waking up in the middle of the night, yelling at his wife in the middle of the night, having fits of rage, and he couldn't figure out why he couldn't control
Yeah.
it. And she was trying to be patient. So it comes out, it seeps out elsewhere if you don't deal with what you're feeling.
Absolutely. And that's such a great example because I think a lot of times we just think, I think as guys, well, that didn't really affect me. You know, just because
Mhm.
my football coach in sixth grade, I mean, I was just in sixth grade, and just so he was yelling at me and telling me I wasn't any good and you better work harder or
Mhm.
why can't you be like him? You know, those things for most of us, they stick.
They
And
do.
and
Yeah.
I think as guys we want to go, oh, I'm tough. That coach didn't bother me. But yeah, it does.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I think for
I,
me, the safest place I've found finally to talk about that besides God is with my wife. And
mhm.
and to
Mhm.
see that she didn't go, "Well, you wimp. You really were gonna cry?" You know, no. She was so
Yeah.
excited that I shared with her on that level, and she was understanding, and she did, she prayed for me, those kind of things. And I think
Mhm.
as guys, we just take that risk. I mean, just take that risk. I don't think you'll ever regret taking that risk.
Yeah.
And if it's the other way, if it's the wife that you're the one who's
Right.
held them in, take the risk. And
Yeah.
because God, it seems to me, it seems like one is one way and one the other. It's not like there's both the
Yeah.
same, whether it's male or female. There's one,
Typically.
yeah, it
Yeah.
just kind of typically
Yeah.
they're both in each marriage like that.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about that, but I think just to encourage people when you do go counseling is not easy, especially if you've let things go or if it's a real difficult subject. And people's expectations of counseling, what would you say to that? I mean, it's going to be hard.
Yeah, it is. It's going to be work, but it's work that's well worth it.
Yeah.
Um, Majority of the clients that I work with have been married 20 years and up by the time they come to me. But yet at the same time, I've seen such beautiful breakthroughs. I can think of a couple that I worked with that came to me when they were married 46 years, and they both came from farming communities, and they were hardworking, and she was a little bit more anxiously attached, a little bit more emotionally in tune. He was highly avoidant, didn't talk about his emotions growing up at all.
Mm,
And as a result, when they came to me, they were literally living in separate bedrooms. And she didn't want to talk to him anymore because she had been so hurt, she had emotionally shut down. This is 46 years in, or 47 years in, one of the two. And he convinced her to come and let's work together. And exactly what you were just talking about, your wife being that safe place. When he had those aha moments, he had no clue that he even felt anything about some of the things that had happened to him growing up. But in our sessions, that was able to come out that he actually felt these ways, and he would things that came out he actually cried about. And his wife, who had been stern and critical by this point because she was so hurt and refused to be
Yeah.
hurt again, just melted to see him like, oh my goodness, I had no idea. And so by the time we're done working together, they were like snuggled up on the couch next to each
Ah,
other, all sweet and adorable, and talking about how they're going to leave a legacy for their kids and their grandkids to see the difference and the change in their marriage as well. So, yeah, it's well worth the work. And I think it's just important to remember life can be hard. You get to choose your hard. Would you rather work hard at counseling and create a great marriage? Or would you rather have a hard marriage that creates a hard family life that creates a legacy of hard for your grandkids? So you get to choose, right? It's just like you get to choose if you're going to go to work. Work's not easy.
yeah.
Work can be hard. But guess what? I choose work that can be hard over the hard work of not having a place to live,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So we all get to choose. And so I just encourage that it's worth the choice because I've seen it over and over again.
I'm so glad you gave an example of a 42, 46-year-old marriage like that because it's never too late, is it? And I think,
No.
I've had a couple of people I think of that were kind of similar in that, and they had an impact on their adult kids and their grandkids after they made that decision because they saw a difference there. And I think it's never too late to model that, because it really is. And I
Yeah.
think the couples that are married listening today, get your marriage healthy for you and your spouse, but your kids are going to reap the benefits of that. You're going to modeling marriage for them because you want them to have healthy marriages someday. So
Yeah.
sometimes, yeah, I think it's important to do it for yourself and your spouse, but your kids are going to benefit from that greatly.
Yeah. Well, and what I see a lot too with some couples, especially as their kids are getting older, is that's when it really hits them. I've got to do something about this because the kids are out of control. The
Yeah,
kids are pitting mom against dad, and they're not, maybe strong in their faith, or they're not disciplined, or they're, whatever the case may be. And they know deep inside, that couple knows this isn't the child's fault. This is because we're
yeah,
setting an example.
sure.
And I think about James, where it talks about repentance, then
Mm,
that confess your sins and you will be healed. And I see over and over again when parents get a hold of what went wrong and they together take responsibility with their teen children, their adult children of, hey, we've done this wrong, but guess what? We've learned. Wow, it's such a healing catalyst for the rest of the family. It makes a
absolutely.
huge difference.
Yeah, and I think that hopefully that gives people some encouragement to maybe begin to take that step. So, as we kind of last question, almost last question, what final advice would you give to somebody who is listening to this and they feel stuck? Maybe they feel like they've stuck. Some people talk about for a long time. Where can they start?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I hear people all the time say, I've asked my spouse to go do counseling and they refuse to, or I tried talking to them about that and they just didn't listen. And I kind of take it back to that first stage, that repair stage. Do what you can for you. Because here's the reality is that if you change and become more healthy, you're on this path together. And if you start changing to be more healthy, your spouse is very likely going to lean towards you.
Yes.
And what I find in my practice is I can often start with one spouse working on their part and their attempt to understand their partner. We try to do that even though the partner's not there. And when they start making changes, often their spouse wants to come and join us now because they're saying, "Hey, I like what I'm seeing here." And instead of being harder now that she's or he's doing this counseling, is actually becoming easier. So maybe
Yeah.
she's onto something. Maybe he's onto something. So doing your own that early stage, figure out what is your personality, what's your attachment style, what's your propensity, where was your family maybe not so healthy, but you didn't realize it until later in life, or maybe you still don't see it. Maybe you need to talk to some of your friends and say, hey, I've shared some things about my family. What do you notice? What do you
Yeah.
notice about me? and allow yourself to get what I call a reality check. But obviously, make sure that that's safe, is a safe person, right?
Sure.
Because you want to make sure you have an emotionally healthy person that you're asking that question to.
And somebody you trust. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And I think it is. I love that you said that come in by yourself if your spouse won't come, because I've seen the same thing that you're saying. As you get healthier, that is attractive, and
Hmm.
sometimes I've had the other spouse that kind of fights against that a little bit, trying to make you unhealthy again. But as long as you persevere and the healthier you get, at some point they're going
Right.
to say, there is something to this. And then
Yeah.
when the other spouse joins, it's always great.
Yeah. Well, and I think that part where you're saying that the other spouse kind of pokes at them, that's that fear, right?
Absolutely.
We I jokingly say God drugs us to get into, to relationship in the first place, but I really do believe that that's part of God's beautiful design is that He gave us this, download of hormones when we first meet so that we'd be brave enough to risk our hearts. And then you get into the relationship and you can have, especially if it's been, 5, 10, 20, 40 years, you have all that hurt back there. So even when the one spouse starts making positive changes, the other spouse kind of wants to make sure you're for real. Let me poke at it a little bit, see what they do with my
Right.
poking, see if they're going to stay, doing what they said they're going to do or not. And once that they see that you're serious about it, 9 times out of 10 or more, the spouse starts to appreciate it, whether they come in for the counseling themselves or not. I actually had one woman who came to me by herself. Her husband was unwilling to come, and she and I worked together for a few months. And then I run virtual events all the time. And so I had an event, and she and her husband came and attended the event. And her husband was in the chat. I'd never met the man before, never spoken with him, typing up, "You saved our marriage. Thank you so much for what you did with my wife."
Wow.
Yeah. And it wasn't all her. She wasn't, it wasn't that
Right.
she was off her rocker and he wasn't, but the positive change created that momentum for the family.
Yeah, that's so cool. Yeah, and it just I think that as therapists and working with people with marriage, that's what we want. We want people to say, "Hey, I don't have to live my life this way. God's got something better for me."
Yeah.
And it's worth the effort. It's worth the work to do that.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So this is such a good conversation. If people want to find you, where's the best places for them to find you?
Probably my website, which is fullythriving.com. So that's fullythriving.com. The same name for social media. You can find me there as well. I'm always, like I said, always hosting different types of virtual
Yeah.
events for marriage. And so I don't have one coming up. I just had one on Sunday called Marriage Mastery Live, which we go deeper into those 4 stages that you and I discussed earlier. So, get on my email list, follow me on social media, and keep your eye out for that because I'll be
Sure.
hosting another one here in a month or so.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's great. And I think, I love virtual because this, couples listening, you can do this at home, people. You can sit in your living room in your pajamas and do it,
Yeah.
and enjoy that. So there's a lot of options there, and is great. I think you will learn much from her by attending one of these. And thank you again for spending time with us. Love what you do.
My
It's been
pleasure.
great to connect, and we'll see you again soon, I'm sure.
Yes, my pleasure. So much fun. Thank you.
Thank you.